Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. And yeah, with that 100-degree weather, I was planning on walking around with a class yesterday afternoon, and we walked out. Before we walked out at 6 o'clock, we were talking about how hot it was. Everybody make sure that you're not going to get dehydrated. If you feel faint, whatever, we'll take it slow. Within, it was about 6:20 when we finally walked outside. By about 7 o'clock, the temperature dropped by about 20 degrees, cloud cover came in, and then we got caught in the rain at about 20 after 7, and then had to kind of hunker down in the lobby of the B building for a few minutes before we could hightail it back across the street and continue with class. So that was fun. We kind of all got soaked, but that's part of the horticulture experience. That's what we do. So just a little bit about my background, why I'm here, how I ended up standing in front of you today. I grew up in Chicago, in Jeff Park, Milwaukee and Foster area. Kind of greenish, not a lot. I had no idea that this is where I was going to end up in the long run. So I went to high school at Holy Cross, which was in River Grove. I think it was Pacific and Belmont, so not all that far from here. That junior, senior year rolls around, you got to figure out what you want to do for the rest of your life because, why not commit to that when you're 17 years old? So I took a strong interest test, and one of the things that came up was horticulture. Looked into a little bit more and realized, hey, this is something I can do. It's something I can get into. Ended up at U of I, Champaign-Urbana for 6 years. I did undergrad work in ornamental horticulture, which is basically just plants outside that look pretty. And then did master's research in turf management. So I spent another 2 years down there and got my master's degree in turf management. Super exciting. Yeah, spent 2 years studying grass. My project was divot regrowth of golf course turf. So by the time I was done, I ended up with, I think, 12,451 pictures or something like that of divots in various stages of regrowth. It was a lot. And this was right around 2000, 2002. We didn't have the storage capabilities we do now, so it was, I think, 120 some CDs full of photos, all of divots. So it was a lot of effort, it was a lot of work, but it was research that hadn't been done yet, and it sparked a lot of other research grants and proposals that came in. So it did start some change, and that was a fun project. That was fun to work on. Then after college, I spent 5 years working in landscape contracting. Realized there wasn't a lot of science in landscaping. It's a lot of, well, the shrub is dead, good, yank it out and put another one in. Not really figuring out why. So I started to look for somewhere that I could use a lot more of the knowledge that I had gained. I really like applied knowledge, which is why this field is amazing. I found a job at Ball Horticultural in West Chicago. If no one is familiar with Ball, they are a huge behind-the-scenes kind of company in the bedding plant side of things. So yeah, way out west of here. If you're familiar with wave petunias, big petunias in the pink packages, Ball owns the genetics for that. They are their genetics. They were actually bred by a brewing company called Kirin that still makes beer, that's still around. They just had a small plant brewing side of, a plant breeding side of things, and they happened to come up with this petunia, had no idea how to produce it, had no idea how to market it. So 27 years ago, Ball bought the genetic rights and have been doing breeding and research with those plants since. And now it started with Wave, now there's Tidal Wave, Shock Wave, Easy Wave, all that sort of thing. So that's where I worked. It was a company that was way behind the scenes, but very much on the forefront of breeding new plant material. So for 15 years, if it was on that campus, which is about 70 acres, and it was outside of a building, and it was green, it was pretty much mine to maintain. So I dealt with dormant pruning, I dealt with the turf care, I dealt with bed design, disease and insect pressure, snow removal, which is the dark side of landscape contracting, like literally the dark side, because you're normally out there in the middle of the night when nobody's around doing it. So you rarely plow during the day, but it's something that needs to be done. So we just fell into it. So that was my college side of things. Looking back at it overall, I've only had one job that was not outside, well, even that job was outside, that wasn't outside working with plants. When I was 14, 15 years old, I was a caddy at Ridgemore Country Club, so that was outside. During my high school and college years, I worked as part of the grounds department at Ravinia, which is up in Highland Park, Outdoor Music Festival. For 6 summers, that's what I did. When I was at school, I worked at the Hartley Gardens, so that was outside. I got paid to do my master's research, which was outside. The only job I had that was outside but wasn't plant related, I worked for the U of I Police Department for 3 years. As a student, we weren't sworn officers or anything like that. We were extra sets of eyes and ears, but I was still outside. And I was outside while I was taking all my horticulture classes. So I would just wander around and study for 5 hours at night. I got really good at IDing trees and shrubs in the dark because we were walking around. We worked from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. So we walked around all night looking at stuff. So that's kind of where I got started. After 15 years at Ball, it got to the point where I was still good at what I did, but I was looking for something new, something different. It just wasn't getting back to me anymore. Like, I was putting in the work, but I didn't feel that connection anymore to it. It became a job. It went from a profession to a passion to a job. Thought I need to reinvigorate myself. And then this opportunity arose, so here I am. Yay. I started just over a year ago, so it's last August. I took all of a weekend between my old job and this job, so it wasn't a lot of time to jump in. But yeah, so I've got almost 30 years of experience working outside, from the time where I had no education throughout my entire education and my professional career. I still spend a lot of time outside wandering around. You'll see me wandering around campus a lot, just looking at random things and cutting branches off of trees and taking photos of stuff. Sometimes it's good stuff, sometimes it's not so good stuff. We call those teaching moments out there. There are quite a few of them. And when I looked back at all that and was trying to figure out what I wanted to talk to everybody about, what could be a takeaway message from this next hour of your life that you so graciously gave to me to ramble at you for a while, there were a few points that came up in my educational past, and then a step forward that I've taken with it. So one of the concepts that I always talk to my students about, it's knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. Everything we do outside, we can sit in the classroom and learn it. There aren't a lot of plants in here, much to Shakina's chagrin, but benefit at the same time because humidity and books don't go well together. But horticulture happens outside. Everything we do is outside. So we can talk about it in the classroom. We can get those concepts. We can get that knowledge. But if we don't get the experience of working with our hands outside, we lose something. So when something goes awry, it's hard to figure out why. And I'll throw this out there because now there's enough people to ask these questions. How many of you in any way, shape, or form have done your own gardening? You got that hanging basket from the box store, you planted vegetables in your backyard. I'm assuming most of us. Oh, good, you don't need me anymore. I can go. You can take the rest of the afternoon off. It's fine. No, just kidding. So in that same vein, how many of you have ever tackled your own major plumbing repair where you decided to move a sink and you sweat copper pipes and you cut the walls apart and all that sort of thing? Good, thank you, Jason. There's usually one or two. Maybe there's carpenters in the room. Ever rebuild your own deck or put up new cabinets, decide to build a table and chairs? No, probably not. You go. You're good. Statistically, that's still zero. We won't worry about that. Same thing with electrical work. No, not many of us are going to say, "Ooh, I need a new outlet in the wall. I'm going to go into my attic, cut the piping apart, figure out, run new thin wall down, pull the wiring in, make sure it's the code, wire that up, make sure it's on the breaker." Not many of us will do that. Because what happens when we do? If you screw up your electrical work, worst case scenario, or best case scenario, you keep popping a breaker. Worst case scenario, you might light your house on fire. Not good. Plumbing, your house floods, living room floods, you get damage in the walls. Not good. Carpentry, your deck collapses, cabinets fall off the wall, you go sit on the chair, all the legs splay out to the sides, you fall on the ground. What happens if we screw up with plant material? If you plant perennials and a couple of them don't make it, what happens? Nothing. You whatever. And you dig them out and you go get a few more and you put them in. You know, if you plant a tree and a few years later it doesn't look so good, you go, well, that one didn't really make it. And you can just go get another one. There are no dire consequences if we screw up in landscaping, at least from the homeowner perspective. If you're hiring someone and they mess it up, you're going to call them. But all of us are willing to try our own landscaping, which from my perspective is amazing. I love the fact that so many of you have actually gone and done this on your own. That makes my side of things more interesting, because instead of having one person I could talk to about that plumbing project, I have all of these people I could talk to about landscaping projects and in your home gardening and your successes and failures. It opens that world up. However, there is a lot of information. There's obviously good and bad information out there, but there's a lot of information that is anecdotal, where you know if you do steps A through H, you'll be successful. But what you may not know, because you've never really studied it, you didn't look through the science, that C and F are akin to, you know, patting your head and rubbing your stomach and spinning in a circle. You don't really need to do those. They're not important. But you don't know that they're not important because you've never really looked into it. And that's one of the things that I try to impart to my students and everybody I talk to in this industry, is that experience and that wisdom. Like, what are you doing? What is your experience? What is your knowledge? What is your process? And try to weed out the things that you don't need to do, because C might take 2 hours. Well, if you can cut that out, it'll make your life a heck of a lot easier, simpler, and may lead you to be able to do more than what you're currently doing. So that simple concept, just that knowledge plus the experience, then you have that wisdom where if something does go sideways, something changes, you know the background, you've experienced it before, you've seen it outside in the field. You can make those changes. If the road starts to curve, you're not locked onto a set of rails where you just have to go straight. You could follow those curves, you could follow those bends, you can make those adjustments, and then be more successful. And the more of us that are around that and have that knowledge and that experience, the more we can answer questions from people who go, this failed and I don't know why. All right, that's why if you've ever talked to a plant person anywhere, one of the first things that we do is start asking you a million questions. Well, where is it in your yard? Is it sunny or shady? When did you plant it? How big was it? How often do you water it? There's this Rolodex in our heads of all of this cultural information and checklists to like whittle down what could potentially be the issue to help you as best we can. And that's one of the things that we can do. And the more information you have in your head and those more experiences, the more that database grows, where we could rifle through and figure out those problems. That's one of the things I love about this, is there's always something new. The unfortunate side of it is once you learn all of it, nature throws a curveball your way. Whether we can debate the causes of it, but the climate is becoming disrupted. Things are not the same as they used to. Again, just yesterday afternoon, I went from telling my students, we're going to walk around outside, you have to be careful that you might get, heat exhaustion or dehydrated because it's 103-degree heat index, to an hour later be caught in a rainstorm when it's 78 degrees and then get soaked on our walk back over to the other side of the street. That's just what happens here. When I first started in landscape contracting in the early 2000s, our snow contracts stated that we'll probably plow 12 times a year or winter and salt between 18 and 20 to take care of your snow issues. How many times did y'all have to shovel your driveway or front sidewalk or anything last winter? 4 or 5, maybe? That has changed. Before I left Ball, instead of focusing on snow removal and inside projects in the winter, we were doing irrigation and drainage work all the way through winter. The ground, 2 years ago, the deepest the ground ever froze was about 3 or 4 inches. Well, that's pretty easy for the excavator to get through, and then you can dig by hand underneath it because nothing was frozen. Where typically we talk about our frost line being a couple feet deep here, 2 to 3 feet deep. That just doesn't happen anymore. So we learned all these best practices, and then nature changes, and you go, well, let's learn again. But that's one of the things that I find fascinating about this, is that it is always changing. And I'm not much for uniformity and repetition. I mean, you don't do this because you like to keep everything clean. It's kind of nice having things messy once in a while. I appreciate that. I like the chaos because it gives you something more to learn. I never want to be done learning. And that is another point that one of my professors brought up, and this one stuck in my head from way back in the day. His mantra for the entire class was, it all depends. And I'm going to ask for a little audience participation on this one because I'm hoping that you answer wrong, but we'll see. If you get it right, then it kind of screws up the next couple of minutes, but that's fine. So he would ask a seemingly simple question, like, what is the effect of light on plants? So what is the effect of light on plants? It's not a trick question, really.
Well, it depends.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, that is the right answer. But most people will just say light makes plants grow, right? Yeah, exactly. But what if it's the wrong amount of light? What if it's the wrong wavelength of light? What if it's a full shade plant in full sun, or vice versa? What if you are in a greenhouse and you have LEDs that have the wrong composition of light, and you're getting everything to grow in flower rather than vegetatively? So that's one of those other understanding pieces that we need to know. You know, what if you take a super high-powered laser and point it right at the plant? That's still light. It's not going to do it any good. It might burn a hole in it depending on the laser, but that's one of those things that, again, with our knowledge and what we're looking at, and that view, you could look deeper than just, okay, light makes plants grow. There's more to it than that. That's why it all depends. And that brings me to the next step that is a term I've been using with my students this semester. And I don't know if I heard it somewhere. I don't know if it's a conglomeration of other things that I've heard. I don't know if it's just a bunch of words that make no sense but sounds good anyway, and I use it and nobody's questioned me yet. But what I've been telling them is that there's a depth of vision that I want them to gain. So a lot of us, when we look out at a landscape, when we look out at whatever, you see the surface, you see it on its front. If you don't know what's behind it and you don't know what went into it, it's hard to see past what's on the surface. So that's that depth of vision that I talk to my students about, is I'm going to teach you to look beyond that. Unfortunately, I also let them know that if they really like just admiring the beauty of nature, I might ruin it for them because they're never going to be able to see it that way again. We don't have to, as professionals out in the field, we typically don't have to fix what's right. If a tree looks fantastic, that's great, leave it alone. If the grass is nice big green carpet, leave it alone. If things look wrong, we have to figure out why so we can fix them. So by the end of this, a lot of the students, they will see what's wrong and not necessarily what's right anymore. And after doing this for nearly 30 years, I find it very difficult to turn that switch off, to pull that lens out of my eye that tells me, find what's wrong because that's your job. I wander around the Botanic Garden or Morton Arboretum and I find myself pulling weeds, or deadheading flowers. It's almost muscle memory at this point. I don't mean to do it, it's not my job, but it's just something that I can't stop myself from doing because that's just what's in my head at this point. So it's just a reality. But that depth of vision goes through everything. And horticulture, it's incredibly wide-ranging discipline. So for instance, this fall, I've just the classes I'm teaching. I'm teaching the Intro to Hort class, I'm teaching plant pathology, landscape design, entomology, deciduous tree ID. In the spring, I end up with turfgrass management, plants and society, cannabis production and cultivation, and landscape maintenance. So again, pretty much if it's green and it's outside a building, I've probably dealt with it enough to know enough about it to teach it. But there's so much overlap with those disciplines that everything starts to intermingle, which is kind of interesting, at least from my perspective, because it's not just one narrow path that you can take. There are so many different avenues that you can take outside, depending on what your interests are. If you really like native landscaping, then that's the direction you take. If you want to design a formal English garden with hedges and all that sort of thing, sure, why not? Somewhere in between, absolutely. The other thing that I find fun about landscaping, especially the design side, there are a lot of rules you need to follow. Like, say, if you're designing a car or you're building a deck, there are guidelines. There are obviously regulations. Bumpers need to be a certain height. Headlights need to be kind of in a certain place. A deck has to have this many supports. When you're designing with plants outside, there are really more guidelines. There's some rules that maybe you should follow, but you're pretty much free to do whatever you want. And if it works, fantastic. If it doesn't work, as we talked about early on, they're just plants. You could move them. It's no big deal. You could pick them up and move them around. You could redesign stuff. You can get more. You could give some to your neighbor if you realize you put way too many in. That kind of thing happens. So we have that opportunity to kind of adjust and play with things and not really be set in stone. I have my landscape design class tonight, and one of the big things that big changes that's been happening in the landscape design world over the last 20, 25 years, designs are becoming more and more eclectic and not following any patterns. Like, for the longest time, you always heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses. Everybody's house in the suburbs or the city looked exactly the same because you wanted to do what your neighbors did. You didn't really want to stand out too much. Now, we all have our own personal tastes, and people are starting to design to those tastes, which, again, for someone that's been in the industry a long time, it's super fun to see because we all look at the world a little bit different. We all have our own personal tastes. So watching those designs happen is kind of an amazing thing. So all that being said, I'm going to get back to this depth of vision a little bit, and I'm going to ask for a little bit more audience participation, just because this is one of those little knowledge bits that we talk about and how I start to peel those layers back and allow my students to see a little bit deeper into what's just happening. Is everybody familiar with termites? Not like you've ever had them in your house, but you just know what they are. If you had to pick the closest relative to the termite, what do you think it would be? Like, who are the termites' cousins out there?
Ants.
That makes sense, right? They both kind of live in the ground. They both have a queen. They both lay eggs. They harvest stuff. They live in big colonies. Termites and ants, they follow along this very similar patterns. Termites are not even closely related to ants anymore. They've done a lot of genetic research, which AI has been helping with because it can analyze genetics a lot faster than people could. So they've done a lot of genetic research on termites. I'll tell you that they're not related to ants. Any guesses what they might be related to outside of that?
Earwigs?
Not quite.
Beetles?
Nope. They're most closely related to mantids and cockroaches. So praying mantis, the American cockroach, and termites all share a common ancestor. And you wouldn't really think that, but that's kind of how those work. And if you start looking at the way cockroaches behave, they live in the walls, there's big colonies, they're never out in the light, you don't really see them, they lay a ton of eggs. They kind of follow that same sort of pattern. But that's one of those goofy things that, you look at them and they look similar. And for the longest time, termites and ants were grouped together until they figured out they really aren't related and things start to move. That's the other neat thing about the plant world and the insect world. Things get moved around a lot where they go, ooh, we didn't notice that before. This really isn't related to this. So we're constantly changing how we think about things. Now, since I mentioned ants, and they're not related to termites anymore, what do you think ants are related to? if you had to take a guess. So what, anybody ever been around fire ants? What can they do?
Right.
They sting you too. What else stings you? Bees and wasps. So ants are very closely related. They fall into the same group, Hymenoptera, which is the order, of bees, wasps, and hornets. And if you really look at that, they live in big colonies. They have a queen. They harvest things. There's a lot of sugar ants that will actually gather sugars, bring those back. So they do share a lot of similar characteristics. You wouldn't think that big carpenter ant and the giant fuzzy bumblebee are related, but they are very closely related. So it's those types of things that we talk about a lot in our classes, outside when we're walking around, to then peel back those layers and look behind them and say, well, what's really going on out here? How can we see this a little bit differently? And then if it ever comes up in casual conversation, you know that happens all the time, how are they related? And it goes back, again, as I mentioned, to that big Rolodex in your head. If you know that ants are now related to bees and wasps, things start to make more sense. It's like, oh, that's why they can sting you repeatedly. That's why it hurts. That's why fire ants are a problem, and things like bullet ants and all that sort of thing. It makes things a little bit more clear in your head. The mantids, cockroaches, termites thing doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just the way it goes sometimes. But when you think about one of the other ones, the big one that we look at, mosquitoes. If you've ever looked at a mosquito up close before you swatted it away or smacked it, how many wings do they have? Anybody look at it? 'Cause most insects have 4, right? They have 2 sets. Bees, wasps, all that have 4. Dragonflies. Mosquitoes only have 2. They are very, very closely related to flies, who also only have 2. But when you think about it, what do flies do? They usually feed on other things. They rasp. They could bite you as well. Mosquitoes just have a slightly different mouthpart, and they're much more of a nuisance to us. But there's deer flies and horse flies and all those sorts of things. So they follow a lot of that same pattern. So it's finding those connections, finding those interrelations that, again, helps our students realize that, wow, if I know characteristics, I know where this goes. It's the same thing when we talk about trees. If we know that it's a maple, you might not know exactly which one it is, but if you know the characteristics that lead you to thinking it's a maple or an oak tree, you might not need to know every detail about that specific species, but there's this laundry list of characteristics in your head that you go, okay, now I kind of know where it's going to grow, its general requirements for soil, how it's going to flower, how it's going to fruit, kind of its fall color, if it's going to grow quickly or slowly. So there's this list of information that comes into your head because it falls into a category. So there's a before we had the world in our pocket, those of us who learned this 30 years ago, we just had to store all that in our heads. Nowadays, for my students, it's a lot different. They can use technology. I don't mind them using technology. I'm going to embrace it. You know, I don't want them to use it as a crutch, but I definitely want them to use it as a tool. So they can use, there are identification programs where you could scan a leaf and it'll kind of tell you what it is. There are other websites like iNaturalist where you can take a photo of something, you submit it even though you have no idea what it is, and people who do will respond and let you know what it is. Oh, okay, that's what that is. So it expands that knowledge a little bit. And that's one of the, again, that depth of vision, being able to pull those layers back is what I really want to get out of my students. And then anybody I interact with talking about this, that's what I hope to do for everybody else is you have an issue. It may be a small one, it may be a simple question. I'm going to help you peel back all those layers to really understand why what you're doing works or why what you did may have failed and didn't work. Sometimes we screw up. Sometimes it's not our fault. Sometimes the garden center sold you a plant that looked fantastic and never told you that it's never going to flower again. I'll ask this one. Has anybody ever been extremely disappointed with those big, giant, blue flowering hydrangeas, then you get them from the store and then you plant them and they never flower again. Yeah, they don't survive the winters here. They set flower buds in the fall to flower in the spring, but the top of the plant dies back to the ground every year, so you never get any more flowers. It would be nice if somebody told you that before you spent the, $29, $39.99, whatever it was on that plant to take it home and then be disappointed perpetually because it grows back every year and you go, oh, maybe this year. No, because it already lost its flowers last fall and over the winter. Now, that being said, with the way our climate is being disrupted, maybe those will start to survive. Maybe if you put them in the right spot, maybe every once in a while you get a winter that's extremely mild and they'll make it through. Who knows? Not a set of dice I'm willing to roll just yet, but things do change. So we change and we adapt. There's also thousands of plant breeders working behind the scenes to make things like that more hardy so we can be more successful. So that's all sorts of fun stuff. All that being said, what time we got?
We're at 1:30.
Ooh, perfect. So we got plenty of time. What I was going to do is, if all of y'all are willing, take a stroll just outside. And we're going to take a look at a few things that are happening just outside this building, and ask you, what's going on? What do you think is happening here? What do you see when you look at it compared to what we can see? And then peel back some of those layers outside to, again, ruin landscaping for everybody rather than just for myself. So yeah, if y'all are ready, as I say to my students all the time, let's take a stroll.